Logo fades into view. New York Association on Independent Living. Thank you to our 2022 webinar series sponsor, Waymo.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. For those that do not know me, my name is Lindsay Miller. I'm the Executive Director at NYL, and today's webinar is on supported decision-making. Supported decision-making is a well-recognized practice by which people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can make their own decisions with the support of trusted persons in their lives. It's a practice that aligns very well with the independent living philosophy, and one that our community has been very supportive of here in New York State. At the governor's ADA event in July, she signed in legislation that enacted supported decision-making grants recognition to decisions made by persons with supported decision-making agreements that have been made through a recognized process of facilitation, preventing third parties from discriminating against them or insisting that a guardian be appointed because of their disability. Supported Decision-Making New York is a project that has been in place in New York for 6 years that has been getting this practice up and running and led to the legislation that was enacted earlier this year. So we are joined by Kristen Booth Glenn, who's a former surrogate New York County director of the Supported Decision-Making New York project, and Joan Cornecio, hopefully I said your last name correct, who is the associate director. They'll be discussing the Supported Decision-Making New York facilitation model, the new legislation, the pilot project, as well as how ILCs might be involved. So before I turn it over to Joan, I just note that we will be taking questions at the end. So if throughout the presentation you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll go through those at the end. Joan or Chris wanted to note that the PowerPoint is full of information. We will send it to all participants. It's intended to be a resource, so we won't be reading word for word on the slides, but it is a resource for us moving forward. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to get us started. Thank you, Chris.
Great, thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks for the opportunity to share the information about what we've been doing for now. It's actually almost the last 7 years. And again, to repeat, these are, I don't know how to make PowerPoints where little people jump up and wonderful things happen and there are pictures and so forth. So just think of these kind of as notes so that you don't have to take them, and you'll have them available to you later. And I promise, except for 1 or 2 occasions, not to read from them at all. So let's just start off very briefly, although Lindsay covered this to some extent, with who we are. So next, and Lindsay's doing the slides for me, so thanks. So we started off as a 5-year funded project by DDPC. At the end of 4 years, which was in March of 2020, when COVID hit, we were right on target for all of our deliverables, and then COVID hit, and then everything, fell apart, and it took us a year to regroup. So it was necessary for us to actually have a bridge year that got funded privately, and allowed us to finish everything that we were going to do under the DDPC grant. And then next. And then we moved into the OPWDD grant. But let's talk about what the DDPC grant was, because it's kind of a roadmap to what we did. First of all, we were supposed to educate people about supported decision-making. Really, nobody in 2016 was even using the term. And I think certainly not just because of us, but it is now, it's really in the discourse. Probably nobody came to this webinar today without having some idea of what it is, having heard the term before, maybe using it in their practice. So we've really come a long way with regard to that. Then what we were supposed to do was develop a process to enable people with IDD to make their own decisions with the support of trusted people in their lives. On the one hand, to divert them from guardianship, and that would mostly be transition age youth, because that's the big entry point, obviously, for guardianship in New York under 17A. And then also for people who had been placed under guardianship to have their rights restored and have the guardianship terminated, both of them using the process that we would invent and pilot and test and utilize. And then we were supposed to do all of that to persuade the legislature that this was legitimate and that it was meaningful and that it had integrity and that it would justify them passing legislation that would require third parties to accept decisions that were made by people who had gone through this process. And of course that happened. And then finally, we were supposed to create a plan for sustainability. Okay, next. So as I've said, supported decision-making is now really widely recognized by just about everybody in the biz. So I won't, go through all of these. We developed our facilitation process. You'll see a slide later about the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm not going to give you, unfortunately, a talk about human rights, but because that convention went into effect in 2008 and most countries in the world signed and ratified it, when we started in 2016, there were a large number of pilot projects around the world, from Bulgaria and the Czech Republic to Kenya to Australia to Colombia and Peru, that we were able to draw on to develop a process that worked for people in New York, which was challenging, is especially challenging because we're so diverse in New York. I mean, by language, by immigration status, by socioeconomic status, by urban, suburban, rural, et cetera. I mean, it's an enormously diverse state. And so that was part of what we had to do. And we did that. And we have about 100 people who have actually gone through the process and signed their supported decision-making agreements, and more all the time. And then with regard to the legislation, we worked, building on our experience, we have a wonderful advisory council, and we created something called Principles for Supported Decision-Making Legislation. Those principles were ultimately basically adopted into OPW's bill. And as Lindsay said, on July 26th, the governor signed the bill and it is now in place. I'll talk a little bit more about that bill later. And finally, with regard to the requirement that we come up with a plan for sustainability, we did come up with a plan, and we are now operating under a 3-year OPWDD grant, testing that sustainability model and essentially doing a pilot, which we hope at the end of the 3 years can be scaled up and can be ready for them to bid out to whoever wants to do it. So good, we just did that. Now we can go to the next slide. Thank you for anticipating. So these are the things that I think you need to know, or that you might want to know, and that I'll cover very quickly. And then I want to show you a video, just one video of one decision maker, and then Joan is going to talk much more about what actually happens on the ground in terms of our facilitation process. So that's what we're going to do. So first, what is supported decision making? And I may say SDM a lot just because it's shorter. And what is it that we do? What is this process that we developed? What does the legislation do? And then how does that fit into your lives? Okay, next. So I always start off with this definition, which I refer to also as the fancy definition. It's by an academic, but I think it's very useful because it suggests that supported decision-making is a lot of things and happens in a lot of settings in a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, it is about a process that allows someone with IDD to make their own decisions about their lives with the support of others. Next. So as I said, and if you went back and looked at that slide, you'd say it's a variety of arrangements and so forth. So it is. So often, and undoubtedly many of the people that you work with have been doing supported decision-making for years and years and years, but have never called it supportive decision-making. There are so many more people in New York with IDD, so many more people who have had IEPs at school who are not under guardianship that we know that out in the world, lots of folks are operating and living perfectly inclusive or decent lives, relying on family members, friends, providers, et cetera. And they're doing it. And that matters, and it matters in terms of guardianship or not guardianship, but it's out there, and I just want to acknowledge that. Then there's a more sort of formal, and it can be informal way of really talking between the decision maker, which is what we call the person with IDD, and their supporters, and they draw up some kind of agreement. There's stuff on the web from some other states that are sort of DYI, supported decision-making agreements and so forth, but there's no recognized process for getting to them. People can just sign them. Then there's the more formalized process, and that's using our facilitation model, which I'll be talking about briefly, and then Joan will be talking about in more depth. And then finally, there's the legalization, and what the legalization says, and it has one purpose. Supported decision-making, I think, has two purposes. And I should just say this right now. Supported decision-making is really about empowering the decision-maker, giving the decision-maker autonomy, giving the decision-maker agency over their own lives. The agreement is useful in a lot of ways, but it is also basically about non-discrimination, because a lot of people with IDD, particularly where there's some visible manifestation of that, like people with CP who have difficulty being understood, third parties will just say, I can't contract with you. I can't take your informed consent for a medical procedure. You're going to have a guardian because I just don't think that you have legal capacity. And what the legislation does is say, if you have a supported decision-making agreement and you are making this decision in accordance with that, then the third party doesn't get to question your capacity. They can just rely on what you decide, and they are also immune from legal action or professional discipline after. Okay. Next. So where does it come from? Really two places. The one which I'll talk about more in a second is our common experience, but it also comes from human rights. Again, I've said sadly, because this is like really where my heart is, that this is a human rights issue. It's not just how do we keep people out of guardianship or how do we get them out of guardianship. It's really about recognizing them as people who have an equal right to participate in the world. But it certainly also comes out of our common experience. And I think that's really important for everybody to understand, because this is not just something for people with IDD. Next slide. So, if we had a lot of time and we were in a room together, we could sit and talk about decisions that we've made and how we just don't make those decisions in a vacuum. I mean, if you do research, you're getting support. The support is whoever, did the work and put it up on the web or put it in the book or put it in the, the journal or the training materials or whatever that you're using. Almost certainly, if it's a big decision, you'll be asking friends or family members, or, in the case of your taxes or buying an apartment or something like that, an accountant or a lawyer. So everybody uses supports. And people with IDD just may need more or different kinds of supports, but we're all using support all the time. And the question is, what are the supports that people with IDD need in order to be able to do what we kind of do automatically? Okay, next. So this is, I think I actually, no, maybe it doesn't come up again. This is the money slide, because it took us a while to figure this out, which we kind of did on our own based on the way we were thinking about the supports that people might need. But then we discovered that there is a kind of a burgeoning industry about decision-making, not for people with IDD, but for the captains of industry, for people in the military, for people at the top of healthcare organizations, about how decisions are made, because we all grew up with the idea that we all make rational decisions, and it turns out that actually nobody makes rational decisions, that there's all kinds of neuroscience and whatever, and so people actually are now being taught how to make decisions, and there are 7 steps. Whether it is, the head of NASA or whether it is one of your clients, there are 7 steps, or there are 7 steps. And some of them we do automatically and some of them we do quite consciously. But they are gathering the information, understanding it, identifying possibilities and alternatives. So it's not always just, should I have this procedure or not? It's, are there other procedures I could have? Or can I wait and see? Or can I have acupuncture instead, or whatever? Considering the consequences, not only of making the particular decision, but also of not making the decision, because that has consequences too. Then weighing the choices, that's actually making the decision. Then communicating it to others. For people with CP that might, or people who don't communicate in traditional ways, they might particularly need support for that. And then implementing the decision. So we all do this, your clients do it, everybody does it. And it's a way that we break this down in order for people to understand, and then being able to see what they're good at, what they're not good at, where they need support and where they don't. Okay, next slide. So just here is my Human Rights Convention, just so that you know it's there. This is an international convention that has been ratified by almost every country in the world except the US, South Sudan, and North Korea, I think, because we don't ratify human rights treaties. And what it says is that people with disabilities are legal actors, and they have a right to be recognized as legal actors and to enjoy legal capacity, which is in paragraph 2, which means not only the right to make your own decisions, but to have them legally recognized. And that's where the legislation, you know, I can say, yes, I want to have dental implants, but if I need to sign an informed consent and the dentist says, sorry, you don't have capacity, then I can't, then my decision is not legally recognized. So that's the legal capacity piece. And then the third part is really where supported decision-making comes from, which is that because everybody has a right to make their own decisions and to have those decisions recognized legally, then the state's parties here, the people who have signed, have an obligation to provide access by giving people the support they may require. So the convention itself doesn't say supported decision-making. The first big document that comes out after the convention, out of any convention, the general comment talks about providing supported decision-making to people with disabilities so that they can exercise their human right of legal capacity, that is their human right to make their own decisions and to have them legally recognized on the same basis as everyone else. So that's where supported decision-making comes from in the human rights context. Okay, next. So what we do is a facilitation process. Actually, let me stop for a second because I think I have time to do this. So there it is, it's human rights, it keeps people out of guardianship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how can we internalize how important this really is? So I want to do a little exercise with you, if you don't mind. If we were all in a room together, like we used to be for these things, I'd ask each of you to like introduce yourself to somebody that you were sitting at the table with, and then have a little conversation and then report back. But instead, I'm just going to ask you to put this in the chat room, and then maybe Lindsay will read us some of the responses, or I'll try to go into the chat room too. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and you have 2 tasks. One is to think of 5 nouns that describe who you are. And I mean nouns, not adjectives. So a noun is like lawyer. An adjective is like thoughtful, brilliant, kind, friendly, competent, engaged, etc. So 5 nouns that describe who you are, and then 3 decisions that you made this morning before you came to this webinar. So if you could just think about that and just put the words in, and then I'll ask Lindsay, or I'll try to go through and just call out some of them, and then I'll tell you why I'm doing this. So take 3 minutes. And I'll watch the chat room. That'll be fun. Thank you, Suzanne. Yes. Oh, these are so good. I love bocce player.
I like nerd.
I didn't get to that yet. Another nerd.
So Robert put his
Yeah, no, Robert is such a nerd that he did both very quickly. Thank you, Robert. That's amazing.
So get gas, get breakfast, go to work.
Nice. These are beautiful.
So I think those that are sending them to everyone, and Alex, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone should be able to see what's being put in the chat.
That's correct. Yeah, we enabled the chat so people can share if they would like to.
So what I love is that at least some of you have lives other than your work and your family responsibilities, like you're a musician or you play bocce or whatever. Sometimes it's just only the other stuff.
Right. David Silva's decisions, whether to spend $5 on a cappuccino.
David is obviously in Manhattan.
Right.
Those subway lines are familiar to us. Oh God, I love this. Thank you. And you're so fast too. Okay, let's just take about 30 more seconds so people can put more in, but we have more than enough. Suzanne, I'm sorry about your ankle. Just how you feel. Okay, so let me start with the first ones, with the nouns, right? I see nouns like mother, friend, volunteer, musician, bocce player, advocate, and a lot of others like that. But for each of these nouns, and I'm so glad nobody said sibling, because this is the one thing that doesn't work. Sibling or child doesn't work. But for everybody else, every other decision, every other noun involves of necessity many, many decisions that got you there. Presumably, if you are a mother, you decided to be a mother. Maybe you didn't originally plan to be a mother, but once you were pregnant, you decided to stay with it and be a mom. If you decided to be a social worker, you made many decisions about what school to go to and what school to apply to and where to get your training afterwards and where to get your credits. If you are a musician, you've made many decisions about what instrument, what kinds of lessons you needed. If you're a guitarist, are you a classical guitarist or a folk guitarist or whatever? There are just many, many decisions, and each of you could just think of the noun that you did for yourself and realize that an incredible number of decisions went into doing that. And so what that translates to, and why I think this is so important, is that who you are, your very personhood, is the consequence of the decisions that you have made in your life. And if you can't make those decisions, if someone makes those decisions for you, makes all of those decisions for you, how can you be a person? How can you be a full person? That's why this is really important. Now, let's think about the things that people decided this morning, right? I decided not to exercise because my ankle hurts. Okay, that was your decision. What if somebody had said, nope, not your decision, time to exercise, or, no, you can't spend $5 on the cappuccino, or no, you can't drive to work, you have to take the bus, or no, you can't get up at 7 o'clock, you have to get up at 6 o'clock, or no, you can't wear this sweater, you have to wear that shirt. And then how would you feel? You would feel crappy, right? You would feel not respected. You would feel diminished if that's the way your life ran. And so that's why supported decision-making is so important, because it is the decisions that you make and that are recognized by others that allow you to be who you are. And because having someone else have the power to make all decisions for you is diminishing and disrespectful and takes away your dignity. That's why we care about this work. Okay. So now let's go to facilitation, and thank you for that. Those were just very rich, and I'm sorry we couldn't spend more time on it, but okay, let me get the webinar chat off of my screen. Okay. So the process that we have developed, the facilitation, has a goal, which is you know, as I've said repeatedly, and this is what supported decision making is about, is to allow people to make their own decisions using support as necessary from people who they choose in their own lives. And we do this through a 3-phase facilitation process. And I'm going to put up the 3 phases in detail in a minute, but Joan is actually going to talk you through how it goes. But I've got them on the slides, so you have it written down. And the sort of cast of characters includes, first and foremost, the person with IDD, who we call the decision maker, in order to, make clear their centrality to the process. It's their process. There is a trained facilitator. We train all of the facilitators who work with us over a 2-day training, and then some additional asynchronous training materials, plus what's now about 130-page facilitator manual. We have a lot of materials and so forth. And then every facilitator has a mentor who is an experienced facilitator who meets with them after every facilitation meeting and supervises their work and helps them problem solve and so forth. Everybody always asks how long it takes. And, over the 6 years now that we've been doing it, we'd say it's an average of about 14 meetings. It could be as few as 8, it could be as many as 20. We think it can be done like twice a month, no more frequently than that, because people need to process, but people have lives, and people with IDD and their families, have more complicated lives than most people. So it can stretch out for, we have people who it took 2.5 years to get through. We're hoping that we're going to be able to figure out how to do that better, but it's always decision maker directed. So, that's how it's done. And then at the end of the facilitation process, there is a signed supported decision-making agreement, which I will refer to as the SDMA, again, for brevity. Next. So again, Joan will do more about this, but this is sort of what we're doing. One is that we're going through those 7 steps over and over and over again, from simple to more complicated decisions, so that the decision makers really understand what goes into making a decision, and they just practice it over and over again. And we call that mapping. So first we unpack how decisions are made, and then we help them map their decisions. And that enables them to see what they're good at and what they're not good at. And then moving on to that, to see where they're going to want support. So people might be really good in the area of education, for example. They know exactly what they want, but when it comes to housing, they're going to need a lot of support in making decisions about that. Or they might need some support in making decisions about relationships, or about the services they get, or about finances. That often comes up. So we enable them to identify those areas, and then again, going through those 7 steps in each of those domains where they want support. What are you good at? What can you do yourself? Where do you need support? What kind of support do you want? Then absolutely critical to all of this, and I think we've been very, very intentional about this, and I think it's one of the great things about the process, is that we recognize that just because we know how to do it doesn't mean that the decision maker necessarily really wants to do it. I think especially with transition age youth, maybe the parents will say this would be a good thing for you to do, and the young person is just like, yeah, I'm happy with the way things are. I'm not thinking about my personhood, down the line, or that this might take my rights away if I'm under guardianship or whatever. I'm like, it's fine to have mom do everything for me. So we really think a lot about what goes into creating intrinsic motivation for the decision maker, so they want to do this, not just doing it because, like with everything else in their lives, they're told to do it. And then we kind of go through the same process with the supporters, enabling them to see how they make decisions and how it's the same process, and using mapping so that we normalize what we're doing with the decision maker. Actually, we've even found among ourselves on staff that this is actually quite useful for us to do, and it's changed the way we make some of our own decisions. So it's helpful for everybody. And then kind of what we call repositioning the supporters from their prior roles in order to enable them to actually be supporters and not to be imposing their idea of what the best interests are, what a good decision is, or whatever. So, that's how do you step back, not that you won't always be mom, but how do you step back from being a mom to being a supporter? which is of course what happens with our neurotypical kids. And often it happens with a lot of, Sturm und Drang, a lot of yelling and controversy and so forth. And so this is a more kind of planned process about how do you do this. And that involves, obviously, especially with parents, exploring dignity of risk and giving them the capacity to do this for a long time. Because there's research, a lot of empirical research that comes out of Australia that suggests that people will go into this and say, yeah, I really want to support this person. I really want them to be autonomous. Yes, I'm going to do it. And then the first decision goes south and it's like, this was a big mistake. I don't know why we ever agreed to this. Let's go get guardianship. So the question of developing long-term capacity for supporters is important as well. And I think that's about all I'm going to say about the facilitation process. Next slide. So the next 3 slides are kind of what happens in each of the phases. So you can just go right through them, Lindsay, and yep. Okay, now, so what's the result? First, there is a signed contract, the supported decision-making agreement. It's really a contract. We have a template. It was quite important that they all kind of look alike, even though they're completely customized in terms of what's in them, because it's what the decision maker wants, not what we think should be in it. And they can define their own domains. They can define what support they want. They can say, I want 6 supporters for healthcare decisions and 1 supporter for relationships. And I want my mom to gather information and I want my dad to help me think about alternatives or whatever. The contract is really what the facilitation process has developed in terms of what the decision maker wants and what the supporters are willing to agree to. So they have this contract. And as things go along and people forget, it's there. And if there's confusion about what the person wanted or somebody starts to overstep, there's this document and this contract. Then it is built to be flexible so that we think of supported decision-making and the supported decision-making agreement as describing the process that the decision maker will use for the rest of their lives. And obviously the domains may change. I mean, an 18-year-old may not think about getting married and having children, but 8 years from now, that may be an area that they really are thinking about and that they might want some support in. On the other hand, there might be an area that they want support in now that they just get very good at and have plenty of capacity and they don't need support anymore. Also, just the supporters may change. I mean, parents get old and like we all die eventually. People move away, people decide they don't want to do it anymore, but new people also come into the decision makers' lives. So, and certainly this happens. There was a big debate always about whether DSPs could be supporters, and our view is that the agreement and the whole process is driven by the decision maker, and if that's who the decision maker wants is his or her supporters, then of course that's true. And of course the DSP may leave or move or go into a different world. So all of that can be changed and we have forms for that and so forth. But but a result that is not on paper, but that we have seen over and over and over again is enhanced self-determination, confidence, and autonomy. I mean, it just, every time, it is just transformative. It sounds like a commercial, but I'm telling you, it just always happens. It's the value added of this process. Even if you don't need an SDMA because nobody's questioning your decisions, doing this process is enormously important in terms of empowering people to see themselves as decision makers and to feel confident in that role. And then finally, and again, this is, I don't know that we've thought about this, but we've certainly seen it over and over and over again and have, millions of testimonials from families that it really changes relationships, that it enables people to step back from, oh dear, you're the neighbor with autism and I'm so nice to you and so forth, but basically you're a person with autism too. Oh my goodness, you've asked me to be your supporter and you've thought through carefully, how you make decisions and you see me as a valuable person to help you make this particular kind of decision. And I'm now going to look at you as a competent adult. And this is really true for parents as well. So that's the product and results of facilitation. Okay, next slide. And this is the legal effect. Right now, we would like third parties to accept these. We would like them to say, oh, okay, you've got a supported decision-making agreement. We feel comfortable that you can make your own decisions, but we live in a very litigious society. Certainly whoever the person who thinks about the 6, the 2, and the 3 knows that people get sued every day, and third parties are often very worried about that. So what will happen over the year from when the legislation was signed is that OPW will write regulations in a process that invites, lots and lots of participation by everybody, including all of you if you want to. And then those regulations will describe the process that has to be used to make an SDMA. And then once that happens, SDMAs made in accordance with that process will have the imprimatur, and people can use them as what I like to call it, the passport to inclusion. I mean, they just can't be discriminated against anymore. People just have to treat them like everybody else. There are SDMA laws in a lot of states, but none of them require a process. And I think it's just important to say here, because you may be talking to people about this, I think it's scary, because you could put a piece of paper in front of somebody, they could sign it, and then they can go to third parties and have no idea, what decision they're making, or whether they've gone through the steps, or whether they're really making the decision or somebody is telling them what it should be. So there's a real possibility of, at worst exploitation and abuse, but at less evil, just sort of guardianship on the cheap. And so what we've done, and what we're really so grateful that New York did, was really invest in us figuring out how to do this right with integrity, in a way that really works, that's documented as working, that's evaluated as working, so that it's an authentic way of empowering the decision maker, and enabling them to make these decisions. Okay, next. So this is just the law, and for now, what it does, and this is so important, and I'll just tell you a little story about yesterday, but it says right up front that supported decision making, whether it's just the stuff that people have always been doing, and yes, I always ask my mom for, to help me get information about a medical procedure before I decide whether to do it, or whether it's through our process. The law says this is a valid practice, that is a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. And what that means is that before a parent or someone else can get guardianship over a person with IDD, they basically have to try this. They basically have to say this wouldn't work. And so the law was signed on July 26th. And on October, I think 22nd, a surrogate in Brooklyn, I just saw this decision yesterday and I shared it with everybody, a surrogate in Brooklyn denied a petition for guardianship from a standby guardian for her 64-year-old sibling. The parents had died and she was the standby. And if you're a standby, you have to come into court and ask to be appointed. Looking at the relationship that this 64-year-old woman had with the staff at the facility where she lives, with her siblings, how she was able to ask them for advice. And she actually cited the statute and said supported decision-making is a less restrictive alternative. She's already doing it and she would benefit from doing it with supported decision-making in New York, and I'm denying the petition. So it's the first time it's ever been cited in a case decision, and there it was. And I cried, and then I sent it to Joan. And by the way, in the meanwhile, Joan has signed this woman up, and she is now she's about to be assigned to a facilitator. So it's very exciting, and that's one thing that it does. It also sort of describes what an SDMA should look like, what needs to go into it, and so forth. And then finally, it does what I said, which is, tells OPW to do regulations, and then after a year, we'll know. And we've also been told, and I think this is important for you to know, that, with the degree of certainty that you can say about anything in this world, that the SDMAs that have already been done in our process, or that will be done in this interim year, will be grandfathered and will get the legal recognition. So it's not just like starting a year from now we'll be doing, it's like, it's going to be our process basically, and whatever we've done in the past is going to be recognized. Okay, next. Okay, what it doesn't do, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. it's an alternative to guardianship. There are people who may still need guardianship. It doesn't stop parents from, or anyone else from, petitioning for guardianship. And either the person or if mental hygiene legal services in it or something might say, I think this person should do supported decision making, the judge can say no, they need a guardian, that's it. So it doesn't take anything away from parents already. It just is another tool in the toolbox, and it's a tool that enhances self-determination. It doesn't require anybody to make one. We really didn't want to be in a situation where agencies can say, well, if you want services, you've got to make an SDMA, you've got to go through this process, whatever. No, it can't do that. And it also only right now, in terms of the regulations and the facilitation process and so forth, only applies to people with IDD, because there is a evidentiary base, in other countries going back to about 2010, and here going back to our project in 2016, that says here's how to do it. We don't know how to do this yet for older people with cognitive decline and dementia. We don't know how to do it for people with psychosocial disabilities. They're very different, and developing what will be the effective supports for those cohorts is something that needs to be done. And the legislation specifically encourages civil society and appropriate government agencies to start doing that process, to fund a pilot project and figure out what works, and develop a process, and then issue their own regulations. Okay, next. So I said the issue was sustainability. We came up with a plan. It started on the back of a cocktail napkin on one of the interminable trips to Albany that we used to make when we used to meet in person with DDPC and everyone else. And it is built around the notion that both facilitators and decision makers will come from a wide variety of sources. In our initial pilot, we recruited them all. Joan and I must have gone to hundreds of information sessions all over the city. We learned every subway line and where you could get Ubers in Staten Island and whatever. And we had to recruit them all. And we think that's not going to happen anymore. We think agencies are going to be incentivized to do this. We think parents are definitely incentivized to do it, because over and over again, we hear from parents, we didn't know there was an alternative. If we'd only known there was an alternative. And we're just seeing that now with the number of inquiries that we're getting on our website. So the facilitators, we imagine, will come from and be compensated, and I want to say compensated, not paid, from a variety of places, including provider agencies, from the private bar. It's very important that lawyers who make their living off guardianship can have an alternative that they can offer to families, especially where they think it's appropriate. And then they can, make a living off that as well. So a lawyer in the private bar who does advanced planning could have someone in their office, a paralegal or someone trained as a facilitator, and then they can offer facilitation services, as well as, the ABLE account and the healthcare proxy and all that stuff. So these people, and we've already done a small pilot about using graduate professional students. We love the idea of MSWs, students doing facilitation as part of their field work and getting compensated by academic credit. And we figured out a way that fits within the credentialing model. And then there's always room for pure volunteers as well. But then how do you ensure that the facilitation that a decision maker in Plattsburgh gets from an agency is roughly the same and of the same quality and monitored in the same way as the facilitation that a decision maker in New York City with a private lawyer and their facilitator, or a student in the Think College at the University of Rochester, where they're being facilitated by an MSW student? How do you make sure that they're getting the same experience and that there is consistency and integrity? And so the model that we have is a central entity called the Facilitation, Training, Resource, and Education Center. It doesn't neatly turn into like some word that we would all remember, like dream. But on the other hand, it is pronounced Fatrick, rhyming with Patrick. And that central entity, which is essentially right now it's SDMNY. So we're the tiny Fatrick, and we're turning ourselves into the Fatrick. And the Fatrick will do all of the training of facilitators. So wherever you are, wherever you come from, however you're compensated to be a facilitator, you have to go through the FATRIC training. You get all the materials and we have extensive materials for each of the 3 phases and recording and so forth. You get all the materials from the FATRIC. And then most important, because we've seen how critical this is, every facilitator is assigned a mentor who meets with them after every facilitation meeting, debriefs, discusses any issues that have come up, problem solves, and so forth. So there's real consistency, and the mentors are all salaried employees of the FATRIC. So not only are they accountable, not only are they all supervised by, in this case, in our pilot, Joan, the master facilitator, master mentor, but also they talk to each other. They are a living community of practice. And so what anyone learns, everyone knows. And it just makes for a much stronger system and a more effective system. So that's the service delivery model. As I've said, where will the decision makers come from? We're already seeing that families are hearing about this and are calling. They're going to come from the pilot agencies, from the private bar, and so forth. Next. So where are you in all of this? I mean, we realized at the very beginning of our project that obviously what we were doing was quite aligned with the work that you all have been doing for many, many decades before we got into this. But our ILC in New York City is not primarily engaged with people with IDD, so we've never worked directly with an ILC. But thinking about broadly and all you do with different folks, if you have clients who are people with IDD, there are a number of things that you could be involved in and that we would really encourage. One is just at the very simplest level, just explaining to people, and especially to families, that there are alternatives to guardianship because they're pushed into it. It's just the default position. That's what schools tell them. That's what healthcare providers tell them, and it's not necessary. And now the fear that even if my adult child doesn't really need guardianship, we're going to end up, in an emergency room and the doctor's going to refuse to take their consent. So I'm going to have to get guardianship anyway. That's the legislation takes that away. I mean, that's the real value added of the legislation also. To the extent that you have clients who might want to do this, you can refer. Maybe, again, I don't know your setups. I don't know your financial situations. I don't know your billing, but you might be interested in offering supported decision-making facilitation as a service. And right now, our partner agencies, and again, I have no idea whether this would work for any of you, but we have several and we have room for maybe 1 or 2 more, is that our arrangement with the partner agencies now is they agree to send us several employees to be trained as facilitators. We train them as facilitators. We ask them to try to recruit decision makers, but we might also send them decision makers who come in through come into us directly. And then the agency just gets paid $40 an hour for the facilitation, which is, what a broker would get paid. And so that's how the dollar figure got. And then, what are other ways that we could be involved? I don't know, and hopefully that will come up in our conversation. I want to do a segue, just as I wanted you to, I hope, internalize why this is so important. Now I want you to see someone who's done it and what they say about it. This is a short video of a decision maker named Jessica, who went through our process. And you will see, I think, that she is reading. And I want you to know that she is reading her own statement. She is more comfortable reading it than just saying it. That was her choice because she's the decision maker. It was her decision that she wanted to read it. We did not write this statement. We did not prompt this statement. We had nothing to do with this statement. All we did was video this statement. So this is one of our decision makers, Jessica. Sound.
And many other people.
Let's start.
Hello, my name is Jessica. I am here to tell you about supported decision making and what it means to me and many other people with disabilities in New York State. Have you ever made a wrong decision? One where you think back and say, oops, that was the wrong thing to do. Like getting a parking ticket. How did you move forward? Did you learn from it? Or did you stop making decisions altogether? I doubt that. I'm here to tell you that the possibility of making a bad decision or a good decision at all is a privilege, one that I want and deserve to have in my life. You can see a person with a disability under guardianship cannot make any decisions, good or bad ones. The mere possibility of making a bad decision strips us of our right to live a full life. A person's life is a collection of experiences, all kinds of them. And I'm just like any other person. I want to live it all. Living a full life means that I deserve to have dignity of making a mistake. The chance that I could sometimes forget my umbrella on a rainy day must not mean that I should never be allowed to walk outside. Supported decision making empowers me to take ownership of my life. It solidifies my connection to a group of people who want to see me move forward. They are not there to hold me back or warn me at every turn. They are there to help me get all the information I need in a way that I can best understand and ultimately support me in the decisions I make. In my case, it also means that my closest caregivers see me thrive with the support of others. They don't always have to be there for me to give me confidence. They know that I can stand on my own even when they are not there available to me. I have done the work of developing these supportive relationships. It is not only right that I can benefit from these deep connections. My team of supporters trust me to be able to make decisions. They believe in my goals and in my capacity to understand choices and take risks. I am a passionate advocate for people with disabilities. I work for the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State and AHRC Nassau. I want to tell others like me that they deserve to be the architects of their life. That needing help from others does not mean that they are not capable of making their own decisions. Supported decision making is a transformational program that makes me feel excited about my future. It helps me take ownership of everything I do. It pushes me to build critical thinking skills. And most importantly, it allows me to be fully contributing member of society. An inclusive world that truly supports people with disabilities has to let people live life the way they want, to go on their own terms, with the support they need to do so.
So that's Jessica talking. I love the phrase "an architect of your own life," and that's her phrase. We didn't make it up, but we use it all the time now. So Joan, I pass the baton and talk about the facilitation process.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Lindsay, I'd sent you a little chat too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No worries. You were busy over there.
Oh, yeah, I'll give you screen sharing.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, because I do want to share one of the tools that we use. Chris had touched a little bit on in the facilitation process, the unpacking of decision making that goes on, and we've actually developed a mapping tool to look at the 7 steps of decision making. So in a moment, I want to share that, but I want to start by just for a moment talking about what actually happens in the 3 phases, because I'm sure you're a little bit curious about that. So I want to paint a picture without slides, just to think about how this all works. First and foremost, as our wonderful project associate Gina Riley, professor of special education at Hunter School of Education, talks about the idea that when a facilitator is working with a decision maker, it's not a one up, one down relationship. there's an equality in the partnership. How do you do that? How do you establish a right relationship that honors the growing autonomy and competency of the individual? And further, and very importantly, how do you encourage the intrinsic motivation to be a part of this process and to really learn how to be a decision maker in the world? So I come to this work as a parent first and foremost. I have a 31-year-old daughter with a developmental disability. So the passion of working with her and raising her, I think it happens with a lot of moms. It's not enough to just do it for your own child. You want to change the world for others. Going through that process and navigating so many systems, it's like, there's just too much information here. Why not share it? And so I've been really delighted to be part of the project since pretty much its inception. And I also have a degree in education and disability work. So I wear a lot of different hats in this work. I've been a facilitator for many decision makers. As Chris mentioned before, every facilitator also has a mentor. What does that mean? That means after each and every meeting that a facilitator has, whether it's phase 1, 2, or 3, the facilitator checks in with the mentor to really enhance the process, to quality control, if you want to put it in those terms. That we're not just working at a vacuum, one person working with a decision maker and not having any soundboard. That would not be a really, I think, authentic process. So there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of brainstorming and troubleshooting that goes on between a facilitator and a mentor. So I just want you to know that we've really thought about how to make this a very deliberate and intentional process from the very beginnings of phase 1. All the way through the signing of the supported decision-making agreement.
You should be able to share your screen, Joan.
Marvelous, terrific. So in phase 1, we spend a lot of time just getting to know the decision maker and developing what we call the big 4. The big 4 being which areas of support is the decision maker interested in developing some decision-making skills and getting support for that. So which areas, who the supporters will be, who are those trusted people in a decision maker's life, what kinds of support, and that's the part I'm going to focus on, what kinds of support does the decision maker want, and how the support's going to happen. The 4th, the how, is really the plan, whether it's, are you going to meet over Zoom once every week? Are you going to meet in a local cafe? Is it going to be informal meetings with your supporters over time? So I want to show you the mapping tool that we use with decision makers and supporters. And this great work, as much of our great work came out of this tool itself was developed by a facilitator. So as Chris had described before, we have 7 steps of decision making. So just as a quick review: gathering information, understanding information, identifying and considering the possibilities and alternatives. You can see the screen, yeah? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yep. Think about consequences, then weigh the options to decide, communicate decisions to others, and then do what I decided, right? So going back up to the top, in order to make any kind of decision, so why am I showing this to you? I want you to, for now, just think in your own minds, perhaps. If we had time, we would share out, but just take a moment and think for yourself about a decision that you made or want to make, a decision of some weight, okay? And what that might look like, right? So first of all, you'd have to gather the information, right? Do the research. What kind of research are you going to do? How are you going to sort through all the research? Do you need support to do that? How are you going to understand the information that's coming through? My big example that I used was I had a knee replacement surgery a few years ago. So you can imagine having to sift through all the information, look at YouTube videos, talk to 2 different docs, get different opinions, talk to my physical therapist, understanding what was involved. And then I had to identify and consider different possibilities and alternatives, right? I could continue on the road of physical therapy that was giving me, moving the needle slightly towards a better knee, but not really what I wanted to have the outcome be for the long term. Consequences, right? What are the consequences of making one decision over another? And how is that going to affect my life? And what's the risk? What are the risks involved? And then, of course, comes the all-important deciding. And when I'm teaching this work to decision makers, I've actually taught it with Gina Riley, professor from the School of Ed. We're working on a pilot. This is our 3rd iteration. We've been working with students at the Cook School, a special education school in Manhattan, and really breaking down these steps. So when we get to the weighing of options, I might look at the class and say, okay, folks, we've done a lot of this work. Now, maybe it's a simple pro-con list as a way of kind of sorting things through. Thought about the consequences, you understand a little bit of what's involved. Where are you going to, what does the scale look like? How are you weighing that scale for yourself? I like this one a lot, the communicate my decisions to others. When we first started our pilot, we used to think that this really referred more to folks with communication challenges. As I've gone through this process and really begun to understand how people think and work things through, I think it's a bigger issue. I think I know for myself with my own daughter, in working something out, she might not have exactly the language that she knows on the inside is going to resonate. So she might need some support to communicate how and what ways she'd like her decision to be honored as she moves forward. So I think there's a lot of different ways and a lot of nuances to the communicating decisions to others and the kind of support someone might like or need or desire. And then the doing what I decided. So we talk about this as carrying out the decision or implementing the decision. And are there supports that are needed as you go through the implementation process? If I want to take 20 pounds off, for example, I might not need to be, gently coaxed by my husband. Why are you sitting on the couch reading a book after work? I thought you were going to go work out. I'm tired. Well, maybe you want to do a shorter workout, right? That kind of thing. So the different kinds of follow through that might need to happen in carrying out a decision. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what this actually looks like. And when we work with supporters, this part of the work is really an eye opener. Because as Chris said before, social scientists will tell us that we all need support for, we all need to understand and practice decision making and understand a little bit more intentionally how we make decisions. And I think that it's really valuable when I've worked with supporters. I see the lights go on. I hear things get real quiet in the room, understanding, oh, this is a way of really breaking down decision making, right? I've had supporters that have gotten so excited about this, they've printed it out on huge paper and put it on the wall next to their work area in their apartments or their houses to remind each and every one of them in the household how to talk about decision making. Also, what does this do? It really, so going back to the idea of autonomy and competence and intrinsic motivation, the beauty of going through this mapping with a decision maker is for the person, him or herself, to understand that, maybe in all areas of my life, I don't need all of these kinds of support. In fact, it can be really valuable to look at, where the supports are needed. Perhaps there are more supports needed in the areas of healthcare or financial, as they would be for any of us in general. Those are big areas of life. And I think that for parents of kids with IDD, I think those are the areas that scare people the most and probably have the largest dignity of risk. So there's a real value in looking at each step along the way. And I'll just tell a very quick anecdote of working with an individual who is on the spectrum. And I remember saying to him one day, so you're really, this is true. I said, you're really good at research. I've heard you talk about different areas of interest for yourself, and clearly you're well-versed in finding information that you need on the internet. I said, you probably really don't want or need support for gathering information. And he said to me, that's actually not true at all. He said, first of all, half of what you see on the internet isn't true. Second of all, I can get overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. So, I was kind of called to task on that, right? That don't make assumptions about anything. So there it was, right? So on his SDMA, his supported decision-making agreement, he wanted added next to gathering information in parens as needed. So just to give you a sense of how we can individualize any of these processes. I'm going to stop in a minute because I know we want to leave time for Q&A, and I see some questions in the Q&A and also some things in the chat. But I just want to so quickly go back to the phases for a moment so that you understand why it takes 6 to 9 months to go through this process. Building the relationship with the decision maker in the first phase, so that you're building the competence and the autonomy, figuring out what the big 4 are, which areas do you want support in, what kind of support, who the supporters will be, and so on. Then the supporters are brought on board. And as Chris said before, that's the education piece, talking about SDMNY, repositioning people from caregiver, friend, parent, advocate to what does it mean to be an actual supporter. Doing some of these mapping exercises. I encourage you to do this at home. I can also send this along to Lindsay so you can have it along with the slides. And then phase 3 begins, and as Chris likes to say, it's the negotiating of the contract, the SDMA, and that takes place over a series of meetings where new supporters might come on board, different people have different ideas about things, but ultimately it all has to get filtered through the central voice of the decision maker leading up to the signing of the agreement. So I hope that paints a little bit of a picture of how we go about the 3-phase process leading to the agreement itself. Should we turn it over to any questions that you might have?
Sure, yeah, we have some questions in the Q&A, which I can read out. And just for anyone who's still on that might have questions, please feel free to enter them in either the chat or the Q&A, and we certainly have some time to get to questions. So someone's asking if the slides are available, which yes, we will make them available to all participants. We have one participant asking, what's the role of CUNY, DRNY, and other agencies that were or are part of the pilot program?
So when we started in the DDPC grant, they wanted us to have statewide capacity. They wanted a collaboration. So the original, I don't want to say, I guess, partners in SDMNY were Hunter, CUNY, and that's partly because it was the fiscal agency that got the money and then did the payroll and all the stuff that they have to do, and it was done through our research foundation. I had been the dean of the law school. I was a university professor. We were incredibly fortunate that the president of Hunter really bought into this and said, I'm going to give you a home. I'm going to recruit faculty members to be part of your project, Gina Riley being one of them. And I'm going to give you space and offices and computers, whatever, for free. So that's why we're Hunter CUNY. Gratefully to President Rabb. Our sort of statewide partner was what was then called NYSACRA, and now it's the New York Alliance for Inclusion and Innovation. We had one provider agency, which was ARC of Westchester, and then DRNY they're not technically a partner, but they're our legal arm. So in those cases where our decision makers were under guardianship, they represent the decision makers in their termination proceedings. And they've also been very helpful to us with a lot of legal stuff. And, for example, they they insisted, and I think rightly so, that the template that we create a template for the SDMA so that, courts that would look a little bit like a power of attorney, so that courts would recognize them, so that third parties would recognize them, and so forth. On the other hand, I should say that we've always included self-advocates in everything that we do. And when the self-advocates were involved in designing the template, the first thing they said was, we want the person's name in big letters. Like, it was just so great. And like, this is the agreement of, and then the person's name, to really say, this is about me. This is what I decided. So everybody fed into that, but that's been DRNY's position.
Excellent. One of the questions is asking if you're planning to track how people are learning about supported decision-making. It's important, this individual says, because we don't think schools or provider agencies are catching on soon enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have any way of tracking, but we certainly have a commitment to informing. And if there's one thing that we know, and that we have learned if we didn't know it from the beginning, is that teaching decision-making is not something optimally that we should be doing for people, when they turn 19, or when a sibling comes in to move to be appointed as a substitute guardian. It should be taught in the schools. We should be teaching kids from from pre-K, through graduation, how you make decisions, little ones, bigger ones, whatever, how you use support and so forth. If we did that, by the time they reached 18 or 19, they'd have a system in place. They wouldn't have to go through SDMNY facilitation. They'd have it. I mean, it would be the end of guardianship. I think that's a 15-year project, frankly, just because I, worked in CUNY for a long time, so I know how long everything takes. But we are working on it. And in fact, the Hunter School of Education now has a grant from DDPC to develop decision-making curricula for early learners, like the little kids, so little decisions. For middle schoolers, and then for transition age youth. And Gina Riley, our faculty associate, is the PI on that grant. So we're working on that. We're really thinking about how this gets included in the curriculum. And at the same time, we really, really, really want to penetrate the transition coordinators and make sure that instead of just sending people to get guardianship, they understand that there's an alternative and they can send people to that. And we have a wonderful advisory council. And one of the things that was decided at the penultimate meeting was that we really need to get our hands around this. And so we have a working group, including an attorney for, I think she represents 90 school districts. And then we have educators and other people. So we're really going to be focusing in on what realistic change we can make. I think educating transition coordinators and educating school boards to make the transition coordinators do this. And then the bigger long-term goal of moving this out of SDMA facilitation later in life and just like building it in and getting rid of the need for any of it. So we can't track. And then we have the same desire to do this. I mean, we're a limited staff, we have limited funds, et cetera, et cetera. We have a website, but we are also going to try to do a plan about the healthcare industry, because they're going to need to know this. And in fact, just yesterday at our advisory council meeting, we had somebody from OPWDD who said, well, we do a lot with docs anyway, so we can use, those channels. And then finally, I think another sort of group that has to be educated is financial institutions. And this is actually great for them, because if people have SDMAs, then the teller doesn't have to make a decision. The teller doesn't have to send them to the, assistant manager, who then says, I can't make this decision. Now I need the assistant manager, and blah, blah, blah. And then there's a lawyer there. Can you make it, or do you need a guardian? It's just like it's done. But we need to get the word out. And, and it's time consuming, and it requires planning and all of that. And, it's one of the reasons that I think that all of you are so important, because you interface with, many of these constituencies, and certainly with families. So spreading the word, it's not just our job, it's asking the rest of you to do it as well.
And do you have outreach materials that could be used as part of that education?
Number one, we have a lot of stuff on our website. We have by now a lot of fabulous videos, of which Jessica was just one. It was just hard for us to choose the one we wanted to show you. They are not well organized on the website. One of my sort of over the holidays tasks is to go back and bring the website up to date, because we've been so involved in doing this transition. But there's like lots of stuff on there and lots of information. We will also, we had, they're out of date, we need to do them, is just sort of materials on what is supported decision making and how is it an alternative to guardianship. We may do some of that in hard copy. We may do, and we'll put some of it up on the web that you could, print out and hand out to people. And just to know also, because I think we've been very successful at this, and we're going to be developing materials again for January when there's a judicial seminar, is that we've really educated the judges, and judges are sending us people. Their court clerks are putting out the information. Their court attorneys are doing it. As I say, this woman where we saw the decision from the judge in Brooklyn, who we don't know. We've never talked to this judge. And then completely independently, Joan got a call and Joan met with this woman. And then I read the decision and I said, oh my God, it's Grace. It's the person you just signed up. So we're doing education through the court system. So, people go in to file a petition in Staten Island. They are required actually to watch a video of alternatives, which includes supported decision-making before they're even allowed to file a petition. But, we don't want people to have to get into the clerk's office. We want the transition coordinators to have it. And we want all of you to have it for your clients. So yes, we will have a couple of, basic information sheets. And then I think the website really becomes the major source. And you can use, it's all open source. You can use anything on it any way you want.
Mm. One person is asking, what does it look like for an older adult or senior with IDD?
I think we can treat them as people with IDD. If there's a dementia component or whatever, we don't know whether this will work like this or not. One of the beauties for me, because I actually come out of aging and adult guardianship, is that this population, unlike what the legislators thought when they passed 17A in 1969, this population can learn and grow. It's an upward trajectory. Mm-hmm. For older people with dementia, sorry to say, I'm 80, so it's something that I'm thinking about a lot. It is a downward trajectory. And so we don't know. But if someone is aging and Grace of this decision, we can actually even send you this decision if you want, because it's just so thoughtful and wonderful. Grace is 64 years old, right? So she's older. She's not demented. She's just an older person with IDD, and we're going to use our process.
Mm.
We've had folks far older.
Yeah,
and Grace too. We have a couple, a married couple in their 70s who live in a supportive housing in Brooklyn, and they had a guardian. The guardian died. I'm not sure of the status at this moment for them, but the bottom line is they wanted in. They're very, very involved in the Self Advocates Association, SDMAs of New York State, and I met them along with another one of our colleagues at an information session we were doing at the regional conference for SDMAs. They're like, they wanted in. And I think that just like you or I, our lives change, and we make adjustments as we do age, right? And go through various phases of life. We're still making decisions. And I think that that right to be a decision maker perhaps becomes even more important, to have your voice recognized. Mm-hmm. As Chris said earlier, we haven't figured out how to do it necessarily for people with dementia or people with psychosocial illnesses per se, but the need for taking apart what decision-making looks like, as opposed to just goal setting. And I want to leave you with one more thought, which is that, folks of all kinds, and this actually ties into something that was put in the chat of who sets the bar between the I and the DD, right? The intellectual and or developmental. And sometimes there's blurring of lines in those areas. We don't set a bar. People want in. People want to do this work. They're welcome to come as decision makers, and we will support that that work, right? The bottom line is, this is the piece that I want to leave you with, is that we're talking about people that have been marginalized for a very long time. We're talking about people, whether there's more emphasis on the I as opposed to the DD part of things, have been the recipient of a lot of services, some good, some not so good. And so the empowerment and the transformation that happens for a decision maker going through this process it's untold, right? Because for the first time, maybe that person is being asked what they want, not what can be provided to. And I think that's a really important distinction.
And as Jessica says, to be architects of their own lives. So I think the thing about older is the age is irrelevant. What we know, what we have developed, what our colleagues around the world have developed are very good processes to provide the supports necessary for people with IDD to make decisions. We don't yet know, because there's been really no pilots at all about what supports are necessary to enable people with cognitive decline and dementia, or with psychosocial disabilities, and they're just very different. So it's not a one size fits all. But age has nothing to do with it. If it's a person with IDD, we believe these supports work. We have done them with quite older people, and they work just as well, and sometimes even better, because these are people who have like a better idea of what it is to make decisions in lives or not be able to, than the 18-year-old who's just always had everything done for them.
Good. I think I think one last question was just, are you planning any trainings to provide or agencies that serve people with disabilities?
So since we think that the critical way of making this a process with integrity, then that really works, that's meaningful, et cetera, is the mentoring piece. Right now, and for the remaining 2 years and 1/4 of our grant, we are limited in the number of facilitations that we can mentor by the number of mentors who we have in our pilot project. So we are not doing information sessions and training people in every agency that wants to know. We've picked, a certain number of provider agencies. As I say, there's probably room for 1 or 2 more in case anybody's interested. And that's where we're going to be doing it. We will take some referrals kind of over the transom. So if you have a client that you think this would be useful for, and we can start in March or April, which is when we'll have a new batch of facilitators trained and our mentors will be ready to start mentoring, we can do that. But we're not going to do wholesale training because we can't support it because we don't have the mentors. But the idea is that at the end of 3 years, assuming that we can show that this model works and that it provides a quality product and that it's, we have a fabulous evaluator who's going to be figuring out everything and cost per person, et cetera, et cetera. And then we give it back to OPW, and OPW says, yes, we love this, and puts out an RFP and says, who wants to do it? And it could be an ILC, or it could be a provider agency, or it could be a university, or it could be, who knows who will become the FATRIC. And then I hope very quickly, because this really is supposed to be a turnkey model, then very quickly, I think it will scale up so that it will be available for everybody. And I should say that right now, every time I say this, I want to put sort of inverted comma quotes around the self-direction system, because I know what a mess it is. But right now, actually, payment for SDM facilitation is a covered service under self-direction. But of course, the person has to use their budget. And that's often often a limitation. But we're working with OPW, to try to figure out all that stuff as well.
Excellent. All right, well, it looks like we're just a minute or two before 12, so we're right on time. Thank you, Joan and Chris, very much. We will share the slides with everyone. The website, SDMNY.org, is available for additional resources. And certainly, if there's any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to direct them to Chris and Joan for folks. So.
And as I say in the last slide, having a dialogue with the ILCs would be really useful for us, because you share our values. We have a tool. That's what we have, and the more we can share with it, the more we can validate it, the more we can persuade OPW and everybody else that it's the right tool, the better it will be. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to our 2022 webinar series sponsor, Waymo. Waymo is an autonomous driving technology company with a mission to make it safe and easy for people and things to get where they're going. We believe that fully autonomous technology holds the promise to improve road safety and offer new mobility options to millions of people. This is why we're designing Waymo Driver, our autonomous technology to give people a new kind of freedom to go where they want, when they want, while making the frustrations and concerns with driving a thing of the past. Logo fades into view. New York Association on Independent Living.